You want more than just the headlines? Find out what's going on and what it means with me, Dennis Prager, this morning at 11, right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Kristen McQueary in for Amy J. this morning. And Kristen, we had you on the show yesterday, actually, to talk about, in part, this sex abuse scandal in CPS that your newspaper, the Tribune, has reported on. A really detailed expose, the number of cases that they looked at with finally getting some compliance from the Chicago public school system. 430 cases since 2011 of sexual abuse / harassment. The city's legal department found evidence of misconduct in 230 of those 430 cases, so more than half. And we're talking about some cases that have actually been adjudicated already, where former teachers and coaches have been sent to jail for raping students. Mm-hmm. But there are many more that haven't been. And there was also the revelation that there's really not policies and procedures in place in CPS that's very ad hoc in terms of how these cases are addressed. You've had administrators and principals clearly, it seems to me, violate the law because it is a criminal violation to fail to report to DCFS and or police an incident of sexual abuse that you are aware of in a school setting. And it's sort of remarkable. I mean, it goes again to kind of what we don't learn or the warnings we don't take. There was a seminal study done by a Hofstra professor named Carol Shakeshaft about 15 years ago on sexual abuse at the K through 12 level. And she, there wasn't a lot of great data, and this study is a bit old, but some of the conclusions were sort of a canary in the coal mine for what has now metastasized in places like the Chicago public school system, where she talks about essentially the percentage of abuse that occurs in school systems where the abuser gets away with it, is lightly punished. It's handled like the Catholic Church handled some priest abusers, which you shuffle them off somewhere else. It's adults protecting adults at the expense of kids.
I mean, there's so much criminal conduct that is exposed through this series that the idea that, we're just going to train everyone, we're going to make sure people become mandated reporters, that's important. But where's the accountability to the criminal conduct that has happened in a lot of these cases? And to the mayor's race, I mean, here's Rahm Emanuel, and we'll talk to Lori Lightfoot about this, who fancies himself being very much in control of every aspect of city government, micromanager. This is the image that he has. Is that really accurate? When you have something unfolding at CPS that is this dramatic, he loves to take credit for CPS, for scores, for universal preschool, for whatever he can take credit for.
Janice Jackson was on those Michael Sachs-funded commercials last week touting the wonderful renaissance going on in CPS.
Yes, and look at the ugliness that is unfolding in schools. And I don't really think he fully... He apologized, but that apology was. I mean, he was in full daily self-survival. Like that was full innocent bystanderism. Right.
And just going back to this Carol Shakeshaft study, she looked at 225 cases in New York, just to give you one example, and this is 15 years ago. The accused all admitted to physical sexual abuse of a student. Only 35% suffered a negative consequence. 15% were terminated, or if not tenured, were not rehired. 20% received a formal reprimand or suspension. Another 25% received no consequence or were spoken with informally. These are for people who admitted to abusing children in a school setting. This is in New York. So it was a warning to school systems to take this seriously. These are incidents that do occur in big school systems. Obviously, there's more likelihood of more incidents. And so have policies and procedures in place, have people not asleep at the switch in positions of authority, make sure people are trained to make the right judgment calls, and letting what has happened, per the Tribune report, occur, and then saying, I'm going to bring in Schiff Hardin to do a $500,000 report on what the Tribune just reported is absurd.
He has a way of doing this, though, right? Like right after Laquan McDonald, we're all outraged, and he creates a task force. I mean, that's his way of distancing himself from being personally accountable, in my opinion.
Well, for more on this issue, because it's one that she took up straight away, and shockingly, it seemed like she sort of caught Tiny Dancer, off guard. Like you didn't see this coming. You must not read the papers. Lori Lightfoot, she is a former president of the Chicago Police Board. She's an attorney by trade. She's now a candidate for mayor of Chicago in the February election. Lori, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
No, my pleasure.
So you were highly critical of what has happened at CPS on Mayor Emanuel's watch, and essentially said he's the mayor. That's where the responsibility lies. You've heard us talking, and you, of course, know what he has suggested be done in the short term. He's also very open to ideas from anywhere and anyone. So do you have any ideas in terms of what you would do if you were mayor with what we have learned?
Well, first of all, I think what he has to do is take responsibility for this epic failure of leadership at the top. If we look at it, and Kristen obviously knows this, by the end of January of this year, the Tribune had put in 5 substantive FOIA requests that absolutely would have put CPS and the mayor's office and the mayor himself on notice. Anybody who's been around city government knows that on a weekly basis, any FOIA requests that come in are centrally reviewed and taken up. And something coming in from a news organization like the Tribune would have absolutely gone straight to the mayor, to his chief of staff. So they were on notice. And the fact that they waited 5 months before they did anything substantive to protect our kids is absolutely shameless and unacceptable. So, yes, we gave very specific recommendations when I held our press conference on Tuesday, and apparently you didn't hear it, so I'm going to send him a letter and make sure that he sees them. But this is common sense stuff to take care of our kids.
What do you make of? I just kind of see a pattern with him with CPS where he sort of has built this wall. I don't know if it's just good messaging on his part politically, but he doesn't ever really bear the brunt of the criticisms of CPS, the janitorial contract and the dirty classrooms. It's the state having to come in and take over special ed programs. I mean, at the end of the day, he appoints the board, and he's very adamantly opposed to an elected school board. Yet, how does he kind of get away with not having to wear the jacket for all of these problems?
Well, he gets away with it if we allow him to get away with it. Look, he's the guy that's in charge. He's picked every single member of that school board. He's picked and promoted the now 5 or 6 CPS heads that we've had under his term. He's responsible. And shame on us if we were silent and let him get away with it. But I think this is one scandal, in part because it involves our most vulnerable people in our community, our kids, that he's not going to get a pass on. He can't get a pass on it. He shouldn't get a pass on it. And what he should have done the minute that he understood the magnitude of this problem way back in January is he should have stepped up at that moment, owned responsibility for it, and done what needed to be done that day to take care of our kids. And it obviously starts with making sure that we've got real robust background system, not just at the onboarding of individuals coming into CPS, but on an annual basis. There needs to be a closer formal relationship between CPS and not only the police department, but the state's attorney's office, the U.S. attorney's office, the state police, any of the actors that are seeing criminal conduct coming up on the part of CPS personnel, so that CPS has that information in real time and can act accordingly. Of course, there should be a confidential and separate hotline for kids and their parents and, frankly, other teachers to report what they're seeing without the fear of retaliation. And clearly what they need is to separate out the people who are doing the investigation from the lawyers who are then going to be turning around and defending the city in lawsuits. We know going way, way back, and I'm reminded of the McMartin preschool scandal back in the day, but we know that when you're dealing with kids, you have to have individuals who are specifically trained to deal with children as witnesses and victims so that they are handled in a sensitive and appropriate manner, but at the same time, you're preserving evidence in the event that there is a need for criminal prosecution. CPS has failed on all of these basic fronts, and it's time to get it right. When we saw Janice Jackson issue a statement, on Friday afternoon, after the story broke, most of the prescriptions that she talked about were things that they were planning to put in place for the things that they were planning to put in place for the beginning of the next school year. Well, there's 2 more weeks left in this term, and then there's the summer session. It's outrageous for the mayor and Janice Jackson to be telling parents and kids that they have to wait yet another 3 months on top of the 5 months that they stalled to get the kind of relief and protection that they deserve.
Where do you stand on just resources for CPS? Because I've heard as it's different representatives of CTU blaming this problem on a lack of social workers, and I believe that's probably true. You don't have enough counselors and social workers on the ground in these schools, but I sort of resist the idea that we need to throw money at this problem, that we can't use existing resources to make sure that we have those bodies on site. Where do you stand in terms of CPS, and if you were mayor, resources?
Well, look, I think we clearly don't have enough social workers and counselors. Those have been shed over a series of terms in the last 7 years. I mean, if you look at, frankly, this plan that requires graduating seniors to have a specific plan for either job or school starting in the next couple of years, the problem, and I think the legitimate criticism, is there's not enough support in the system for them to actually realize the ability to have a plan upon graduation. So it sounds good, but it's not realistic given the cuts that have been made. I think this is something we obviously have to dig into, but what I do know is that we need to build an infrastructure to protect our kids. The sad reality is, and I think Dan was alluding to this earlier when he was talking about the study from New York, schools are a hunting ground for predators. We can't put our head in the sand about that sad and sick reality. And given that reality, we need to make sure that from day one that a kid walks into school, that they have the support that they need to make sure that they are not going to be harmed in school where they should be nurtured. Well, and one other thing that I think has to be done is we've got to make sure that kids know their rights, that this is part of the social and emotional curriculum that's being taught in CPS.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things here. Just in terms of the resource question, it's not a resource question to do background checks as thoroughly as you do for volunteer coaches at these schools. I mean, there's just no excuse for it. There's no defense to it. And also what we're talking about in many of these cases reported by the Tribune is people who were made aware in positions of authority and mishandled the matter. So it could have been referred out so that the kid could have gotten the counseling he needs. The DCFS could have come in. The police could have investigated. And it wasn't. And just to distinguish it from the McMartin case you mentioned in California, I mean, there were no convictions ultimately in that daycare case. We've already had employees convicted of sex abuse crimes here, and that still hasn't garnered the attention of authorities.
Well, and the other thing regarding the resource question, right, is if we're penny wise on the front end, and I question whether or not we're wise, we're going to pay on the back end. We already seen the first of these lawsuits that are going to be filed, and I'm sure it's not going to be the only ones. I think we're going to see an avalanche of lawsuits from parents and kids who feel like the system has failed them. So we're going to pay, and it's better to pay on the front end, frankly, when it costs less, and that we're actually doing something to protect our kids. Yeah. But I think the points that Dan has raised are 100% right. There's no real additional cost to just do your job, to have that background checks actually be done thoroughly in a centralized manner, not letting individual schools onboard these volunteer coaches without going through rigorous training and background screening. That should just never, ever happen. And when the red flags hit, somebody has to be responsible for acting. I
want to get your take on another matter because, of course, one of your credentials running for mayor is you're the former president of the Chicago Police Board, and with the Laquan McDonald trial in the offing, the Van Dyke trial about the Laquan McDonald case, of course, and then the controversy around the violent incidents of violent crime in the city, the feeling among a lot of Chicago police that the civilian political authorities don't have their backs, and so stops are down, and proactive policing seems to be muted. And you have a city with the summer setting in that the first couple of weekends have been described as sort of mayhem. So what about the balance between people who are concerned about issues like police abuse, but also who want police in their neighborhoods protecting them?
Yeah. Well, look, I think for me, this really boils down to, do we want to make sure that our most vulnerable citizens, and particularly those children in crime-plagued and economically distressed neighborhoods, get the kind of public safety that they deserve? Public safety can't be a commodity only for the wealthy. It's got to be something that is available to all citizens. And look, this is one of the toughest times for policing, probably in U.S. history. There's no question about that. But I reject this notion that if you're for the community, you're anti-police, or if you're for the police, you're anti-community. We have to be united in a common sense of purpose, where we have our officers understanding what the rules are, being led by leaders who get the value and the necessity of constitutional policing, who understand that, frankly, for officers to be effective, to fight and solve crimes, they have to have the community on their side, and for the community to understand, frankly, that the vast majority of officers come on the job for the right reasons, stay on the job for the right reasons, but they have to get the kind of training and leadership that they need to understand how to do their job effectively in these challenging times. And I think, despite what the union leadership may say, the rank and file police officers that I know personally, and frankly who stop me on a regular basis, want to do the right thing. They want the leadership. They want to know what the rules are. They don't want to be punished like criminals for honest mistakes, which is fair. But they also, frankly, don't want a bunch of folks who are in a uniform who are abusing the power that they've been given, because, frankly, that casts a pall on every other officer that's out there that's doing their job the right way. I think what we need to keep doing is speaking the truth. We need to keep making sure that we're supporting our officers with appropriate training, but we also need to keep pressing the police department to take ownership of bridging the divide between themselves and the community.
All right. She is Lori Lightfoot. She's the former president of Chicago Police Board, a candidate for Chicago mayor. Lori, a website where people can get more information about your candidacy?
Sure, lightfootforchicago.com, and we're also very active on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
All right, Lori Lightfoot, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And she joined us on the Turnkey.pro